A family rescues a mysterious stray dog during a storm, unaware that they have brought home a creature linked to an ancient lineage. When authorities intervene, secrets unravel, leaving the family torn between protecting their newfound companion and uncovering a truth that could change everything. Welcome to this exciting story. Before we dive in, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more amazing adventures. And hey, let me know in the comments, which country are you watching from? I'd love to hear from you. The Carter family's house sat on the edge of Fairhaven, a cozy, single-story home surrounded by a modest yard bordered by a wooden fence. By the time they arrived, the rain had lessened, though the storm clouds still loomed overhead, rumbling in the distance. Evelyn held Ragnar's leash tightly as they led him to the porch. His paws padded softly against the wooden steps, leaving muddy prints in his wake. "First things first," Daniel said, holding the door open. "Let's dry him off before he soaks the whole house." Josh groaned. "I can't believe we're actually letting this thing inside. What if he's not even a dog? He looks like, I don't know, part wolf or something." Evelyn shot him a glare. "He's not dangerous, Josh. He's just scared." Mia handed Evelyn a towel, and together, they began drying Ragnar's fur. Up close, Evelyn noticed more of his peculiar features. The way his fur seemed to shimmer faintly under the porch light, the unusually sharp curve of his ears, and the way his amber eyes seemed to follow every movement with unnerving focus. "I've never seen a dog like this before," Mia murmured, brushing her fingers over Ragnar's thick coat. "It's like his fur is glowing." "It's just the light," Daniel said quickly, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "Let's get him inside before he catches pneumonia, or gives us all hypothermia standing out here." Once inside, Ragnar seemed to hesitate, his large frame almost dwarfing the cozy living room. He sniffed the air cautiously, his ears twitching at every sound. The hum of the fridge, the ticking of the wall clock, the faint creak of the wooden floorboards. Evelyn led him to the corner near the fireplace, where she had spread out an old blanket to make a makeshift bed. "There you go, boy," she said softly, patting the blanket. Ragnar tilted his head, staring at her for a moment before stepping onto the blanket. He circled once, then twice before finally lying down, his long tail curling around his body. "See," Evelyn said, beaming. "He's perfect." Josh rolled his eyes. "Yeah, perfect until he chews up Mom's favorite chair." "Josh," Mia warned, though her tone was more amused than stern. That night, the family gathered in the kitchen for a late-night snack. Evelyn couldn't stop glancing toward the living room, where Ragnar lay silently on his blanket, his glowing eyes half closed but still watching everything. "Do you think he's hungry?" Evelyn asked, looking up at her parents. "I'm sure he is," Mia replied. She opened the fridge and pulled out the leftover chicken from dinner. "Let's see if he likes this." Evelyn took the plate of shredded chicken and placed it on the floor in front of Ragnar. For a moment he just stared at it, his nose twitching. Then, with surprising speed, he devoured the meat in a few large gulps. "Whoa," Josh said, leaning against the kitchen counter. Guess he was starving, but Evelyn frowned. "He didn't even chew it." Mia waved it off. "He's probably just adjusting." Poor thing must have been starving out there in the rain. As the house settled into quiet for the night, Ragnar remained where he was, his head resting on his paws. Evelyn peeked into the living room one last time before heading to bed. "Good night, Ragnar," she whispered. He lifted his head slightly, his glowing eyes meeting hers. There was something in his gaze, something that felt deeper than any look she'd ever seen from a dog. It made her pause, her hand resting on the doorframe. "Evelyn!" Josh's voice startled her, and she turned to see him standing at the top of the stairs. "Are you coming to bed? Or are you going to stare at him all night?" Blushing, she hurried up the stairs, throwing one last glance over her shoulder. Ragnar had shifted his gaze to the window, his ears pricked as if listening for something far away. In the dead of night, Daniel was the first to stir. He wasn't sure what had woken him at first. The rain had stopped, and the house was eerily silent. Then he heard it, a low, rumbling growl. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding. "Mia," he whispered, nudging his wife. "Do you hear that?" Mia groaned, half asleep. "It's probably just the dog." But Daniel wasn't convinced. He slipped out of bed and padded softly down the stairs, his hand gripping the railing tightly. As he reached the bottom step, the growl grew louder, more guttural. It sent a shiver down his spine. He turned the corner into the living room and froze. Ragnar was standing by the window, his back to Daniel, his body tense and alert. His fur seemed to shimmer faintly in the moonlight, and his glowing eyes reflected in the glass. Outside, the yard was cloaked in shadow, but Daniel thought he saw movement. Something darting past the fence line, too quick to make out. "Ragnar," Daniel said softly. The dog turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge Daniel's presence. Then, as if satisfied that the threat was gone, he relaxed and returned to his blanket, curling up once more. Daniel stood there for a long moment, staring out into the dark yard. The uneasy feeling in his chest wouldn't go away. As the Carter family sleeps, Ragnar's glowing eyes snap open once more, fixed on the window. The camera pans outside, where a shadowy figure lurks near the fence, its silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. The morning sunlight broke through the rain-soaked clouds, casting a soft, golden glow over the Carter household. Evelyn woke up early, excitement bubbling in her chest. She hurried downstairs, eager to check on Ragnar. She found him curled up on the blanket by the fireplace, his large ears twitching slightly in response to her footsteps. "Morning, Ragnar," she whispered, crouching beside him. His glowing amber eyes opened, meeting hers with a steady, almost curious gaze. Evelyn reached out to stroke his fur, marveling at how soft and thick it felt. As if understanding her words, Ragnar let out a low, contented sound, somewhere between a growl and a hum. Evelyn smiled, feeling a strange but comforting bond with the creature. "Evelyn, breakfast." Mia's voice called from the kitchen, breaking the moment. Evelyn reluctantly got up and headed to the kitchen, where her family was already gathered around the table. "Did you see what he did to the couch last night?" Daniel asked, holding up a cushion that had deep claw marks raked across its surface. Evelyn frowned. "He was probably scared. You can't blame him for that. Scared or not, those are some serious claws," Daniel muttered. "We need to figure out what kind of dog he is, and make sure he's not dangerous." "I agree," Mia said, setting a plate of scrambled eggs on the table. "We should take him to Dr. Shore today. She'll know more about him." Evelyn opened her mouth to argue but stopped when she saw her father's stern expression. She knew there was no point in fighting this. "Fine," she mumbled, poking at her breakfast. The Fairhaven Veterinary Clinic was a small but welcoming place, with white walls and cheerful posters about pet care. Evelyn held tightly to Ragnar's leash as they entered the waiting room. The dog walked beside her calmly, his sharp eyes scanning the room with keen awareness. The receptionist, a young woman with bright red hair, looked up from her desk and smiled. "Good morning. Is this your new friend?" "Yes," Mia said, stepping forward. "We found him last night during the storm. We'd like Dr. Shore to take a look at him." The receptionist nodded. "Of course. She's just finishing up with another patient. Please have a seat." Evelyn and her family sat down, Ragnar settling at her feet. Other pets in the room, a yapping terrier and a nervous cat, reacted strangely to his presence. The terrier tucked its tail between its legs and whimpered, while the cat hissed and tried to hide behind its owner. Evelyn noticed but said nothing, stroking Ragnar's fur to keep him calm. "Carter family?" A voice called out. Dr. Helena Shore, a tall woman in her mid-40s with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes, stood in the doorway. She smiled warmly at the family. "Come on in." The Carters followed her into the examination room, where Ragnar hopped up onto the steel table with surprising agility. Dr. Shore began her routine checks, starting with his ears and teeth. "Huh," she murmured, frowning slightly as she examined his sharp, perfectly white teeth. "These don't look like regular canine teeth. They're unusual." "What do you mean?" Daniel asked, his voice edged with concern. Dr. Shore didn't answer immediately. She moved on to check Ragnar's fur, running her hands over the shimmering coat. Her frown deepened. This texture, it's almost metallic. I've never felt anything like it. Evelyn watched nervously as the vet continued her examination, flipping through a reference book and muttering to herself. She measured his claws, his ears, and even took a small blood sample, her hands trembling slightly as she worked. Finally, Dr. Shore stepped back, her face pale. She cleared her throat and gave a forced smile. "Excuse me for just a moment. I need to check something. Is everything okay?" Mia asked, sensing the vet's unease. Dr. Shore hesitated. "It's probably nothing. I just need to confirm something. I'll be right back." Without waiting for a response, she hurried out of the room, leaving the Carters in awkward silence. Evelyn glanced at Ragnar, who was sitting calmly on the table, his glowing eyes watching the door where the vet had just disappeared. "What was that about?" Josh asked, breaking the silence. "I don't know," Daniel said, his tone wary, "but it didn't look good." In the hallway outside, the Carters could hear muffled voices. Dr. Shore's voice was low but urgent, speaking to someone on the phone. "Yes, I'm sure. No, it's not just a hybrid. I've never seen anything like this before. Yes, I'll keep them here until you arrive." Mia's eyes widened. Did she just say, "Keep them here"? What's going on? Before anyone could answer, the door swung open. Two men in khaki uniforms with wildlife agency badges entered the room, their expressions grim. One of them carried a thick folder, while the other held a restraint pole. "Good morning," the taller of the two said, his tone professional but cold. "We're with the Fairhaven Wildlife Division. We need to take this animal into custody." Evelyn jumped to her feet, stepping protectively in front of Ragnar. "You can't take him. He hasn't done anything wrong." "I'm sorry, miss," the man said, his tone softening slightly, "but this is a matter of public safety. This animal is unusual, and we need to ensure he doesn't pose a threat." "He's not a threat," Evelyn cried, tears streaming down her face. "He's my friend." Mia pulled her daughter back, trying to calm her. "There must be some mistake," she said to the officers. "He's just a dog. A stray we found last night." The officer shook his head. "Ma'am, we've dealt with cases like this before. He's not just a dog. Based on the vet's report, he's something else entirely." As the officers approached Ragnar, the dog let out a low growl, his fur bristling. For a moment, Evelyn thought he might attack, but instead, he stepped forward calmly, as if understanding what was happening. The officers secured him with the restraint pole, and Ragnar didn't resist, though his glowing eyes remained fixed on Evelyn. "Please don't take him," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible. The taller officer hesitated, glancing at her tear-streaked face, but then he straightened. "We're just doing our job, miss." "I'm sorry." As they led Ragnar out of the room, Evelyn's heart shattered. She ran after them, but Mia held her back, tears in her own eyes. "We'll figure this out," she promised, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. Evelyn stood in the clinic's parking lot, watching as the wildlife van drove away with Ragnar inside, her fists clenched at her sides. She didn't know how, but she swore she would bring him back. Evelyn stared out the window of her room, her mind racing as she replayed the events at the vet's clinic. The image of Ragnar being led away by the wildlife officers was burned into her memory, and the ache in her chest refused to subside. She glanced at her phone, where she had saved a picture of Ragnar from the night before. His glowing eyes and majestic fur looked almost otherworldly in the dim light. Downstairs, her parents were arguing in hushed voices. Evelyn could make out fragments of the conversation. Daniel's concerns about the family's safety, Mia's insistence that something wasn't right about the situation, but she didn't care. All that mattered was bringing Ragnar back. She grabbed her backpack and crept down the stairs, careful not to alert her parents. As she reached the door, a voice stopped her. "Where do you think you're going?" Evelyn turned to see Josh leaning against the kitchen counter, arms crossed. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by a serious expression. "I'm going to find Ragnar," she said firmly. "I can't just sit here and do nothing." Josh sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "Look, I know you're upset, But you can't just storm into some government facility and demand they give him back. That's not how this works. Then what do you suggest? Evelyn snapped. Because I'm not going to let them keep him locked up like some lab experiment. Josh studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, let's think this through. First, we need to figure out where they took him. Evelyn's eyes widened in surprise. You're going to help me? Josh shrugged. Ragnar might be weird, but he saved Dad from whatever was outside last night. He doesn't deserve this. They headed to the living room, where Josh pulled out his laptop. Evelyn watched as his fingers flew across the keyboard, searching for information on the Wildlife Agency. After a few minutes, he found a press release about a secure containment facility just outside town. That's gotta be it, Josh said, pointing to the screen. North Ridge Wildlife Center. It's a high-security place for handling exotic animals. Evelyn's heart sank. How are we supposed to get in there? Josh smirked. Leave that part to me. The next morning, Evelyn and Josh visited Mr. Grant, the retired wildlife researcher who lived next door. His cluttered house was filled with books, maps, and framed photos of him working with animals around the world. When Evelyn explained what had happened, his expression darkened. I had a feeling something like this might happen, he said, stroking his beard thoughtfully. That dog, or whatever he is no ordinary stray. If the government has him, they're not just going to let him go. Evelyn leaned forward. Can you help us? Mr. Grant nodded slowly. If we're going to do this, we'll need a plan. Let me grab something. He disappeared into another room and returned with a rolled-up map. Spreading it out on the table, he pointed to a section marked with the Wildlife Center's location. This facility is designed to keep people out, he said. But every security system has its weaknesses. Over the next few hours, the three of them worked together to map out a plan. Josh hacked into the center's website to access blueprints of the building, while Mr. Grant provided insight into how wildlife facilities typically operated. Evelyn listened carefully, memorizing every detail. The plan was risky but straightforward. They would sneak into the facility under the cover of night, disable the security cameras, and locate Ragnar's holding area. Mr. Grant would stay in the car as a lookout, while Josh guided Evelyn through the building using a headset and live camera feeds. As the sun set, Evelyn felt a mix of fear and determination. She packed her backpack with essentials, flashlights, gloves, and a small first aid kit, and slipped on her sneakers. Josh handed her a small earpiece and a pocket-sized camera. Stick this on your jacket, he said. It'll give me a live feed so I can guide you through the building. Evelyn nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened the camera. What if something goes wrong? Josh placed a hand on her shoulder. We'll get him back. Promise. At midnight, the three of them drove to the Wildlife Center in Mr. Grant's old van. The facility loomed in the darkness, its tall fences topped with barbed wire and security cameras mounted on every corner. Evelyn's stomach churned as she stared at the building, but she took a deep breath and reminded herself why she was doing this. Ready? Josh's voice crackled through her earpiece. Ready, Evelyn whispered, stepping out of the van. She crouched low as she approached the fence, her heart pounding in her ears. Mr. Grant had already cut a small opening in the wire earlier that day, and she slipped through it easily. Once inside, she moved quickly but cautiously, staying in the shadows. Okay, you're clear, Josh said. Head to the left. There's a door with a keypad. I'll handle the code. Evelyn found the door and waited as Josh worked his magic. After a few seconds, the lock clicked open, and she slipped inside. The air inside the building was cold and sterile, filled with the faint hum of machinery. Take the hallway to your right, Josh instructed. There should be a storage room where you can hide if you need to. Evelyn followed his directions, her nerves on edge. Every creak of the floorboards and distant sound of footsteps made her jump, but she pressed on. She had to find Ragnar. Finally, she reached a room with reinforced glass windows. Inside, she saw him. Ragnar was lying on a metal table, his fur glinting faintly under the harsh fluorescent lights. He looked dazed but unharmed. I found him, Evelyn whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Good, Josh said. Now we just have to get him out. Evelyn moved to the door and tried the handle, but it was locked. "It's locked," she hissed. "Give me a second," Josh replied. "There should be an override panel nearby." Evelyn spotted the panel and relayed its location to Josh. As he worked to disable the lock, she kept glancing back at Ragnar, willing him to wake up. The sound of approaching footsteps made her freeze. 2 guards were walking down the hall, their voices growing louder. Evelyn's pulse quickened as she ducked into a nearby storage closet, holding her breath. The guards stopped outside Ragnar's room, their conversation muffled through the door. Evelyn couldn't make out what they were saying, but their presence was enough to delay the rescue. "Evelyn," Josh whispered in her ear. "They're not leaving. You'll have to wait until they're gone." Evelyn clenched her fists, frustration boiling inside her. She had come so close and now she was stuck. But she wasn't going to give up, not now, not ever. Evelyn held her breath in the closet, her hands trembling as the guards continued their muffled conversation. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing louder in her ears. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the guards walked away, their voices fading into the distance. "Evelyn," Josh's voice crackled in her earpiece. "It's clear now. I've disabled the lock on Ragnar's room. You need to move fast." Evelyn peeked out of the storage closet. The hallway was empty. Taking a deep breath, she darted out, her sneakers barely making a sound on the polished floor. She reached Ragnar's room, her fingers fumbling with the door handle as she pushed it open. Inside, Ragnar lifted his head weakly, his glowing eyes meeting hers. He let out a low whine, his ears twitching as if recognizing her. Evelyn rushed to his side, gently placing a hand on his shimmering fur. "It's okay, boy," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "I'm here. We're getting out of here." Josh's voice interrupted her moment. "You need to hurry, Evelyn. I'm picking up movement on the cameras. More guards are heading your way." Evelyn glanced around the room, spotting a cart with syringes and medical tools. She grabbed a pair of scissors and used them to cut through the leather straps binding Ragnar to the table. He stood shakily, his powerful body visibly tense, but his eyes burned with determination. "Let's go," Evelyn urged, tugging on his makeshift leash. They moved quickly through the facility, following Josh's directions. Every step brought them closer to freedom, but Evelyn's anxiety grew with each corner they turned. The building felt like a maze, and the sound of distant footsteps kept her on edge. "Take the next left," Josh said. "There's an emergency exit at the end of the hall." Evelyn and Ragnar turned the corner, but their path was blocked by a security guard. The man froze for a moment, his eyes widening as he took in Ragnar's size and glowing eyes. Before he could react, Ragnar let out a deep, menacing growl, his fur bristling. "Stay back," the guard shouted, raising a stun baton. Evelyn's mind raced. She couldn't let Ragnar get hurt, but she also couldn't afford to be caught. Thinking quickly, she grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and aimed it at the guard. She pulled the pin and squeezed the handle, releasing a cloud of white foam that blinded the man. "Run!" she yelled, and Ragnar bolted forward, staying close to her side. They reached the emergency exit, but it was locked. Evelyn's heart sank as she yanked on the door handle, her desperation mounting. "Josh, the door's locked," she cried into the earpiece. "I'm on it," Josh replied. "Give me 10 seconds. Behind them, the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. Evelyn turned to see 2 more guards entering the hallway, their weapons drawn. "Josh, we don't have 10 seconds, she shouted. The lock clicked just as the guards raised their batons. Evelyn pushed the door open and darted outside, Ragnar following close behind. The cold night air hit her face, and she felt a rush of relief as they sprinted toward the fence. Mr. Grant was waiting in the van, the engine running. He opened the back doors as Evelyn and Ragnar approached. "Get in," he yelled. Evelyn helped Ragnar climb into the van before jumping in herself. Mr. Grant slammed the doors shut and hit the gas, speeding away from the facility. Evelyn looked back through the window, watching the guards disappear into the distance. The van sped through the quiet streets, the hum of the engine the only sound breaking the silence. Evelyn sat in the back with Ragnar, her arms wrapped protectively around his shimmering coat. His breathing was steady, but his glowing amber eyes darted between her and the window, as if sensing a threat still lingering in the darkness. "Where do we go now?" Evelyn asked, her voice trembling. "We can't go home," Mr. Grant said from the driver's seat. "The wildlife agency will be watching. I have a safe place, a cabin in the woods. It's secluded, and we'll be able to figure out what to do next." Josh, seated in the passenger seat, turned to look at Evelyn. "We need answers, Ev. What is Ragnar? Why are they so desperate to take him?" Evelyn glanced down at Ragnar. "He's not just a dog," she said quietly. "We've known that since the moment we found him." The cabin was nestled deep within a dense forest, its wooden structure almost camouflaged among the towering trees. As they arrived, the first rays of dawn pierced through the canopy, casting long shadows across the ground. Evelyn helped Ragnar out of the van, and he stretched his powerful limbs before sniffing the air. Inside, the cabin was modest but cozy, with a stone fireplace and shelves lined with old books and artifacts. Mr. Grant wasted no time, pulling out a stack of papers and maps from a locked chest in the corner. "I've seen something like this before," he said, spreading the documents across the table. "During my time as a wildlife researcher, I came across stories, legends, really, about creatures that were part of an ancient lineage. They were protectors, guardians of balance, but they disappeared centuries ago." Evelyn frowned. "You're saying Ragnar is one of them?" Mr. Grant nodded. "It's possible." His glowing eyes, the metallic sheen of his fur, and his unusual intelligence all matched the descriptions in these texts. Josh leaned over the table, examining the yellowed pages. "But why would the government care about a legend?" "They might know more than we do," Mr. Grant replied. "If they've identified Ragnar as one of these creatures, they'll want to control him or worse, experiment on him." As the discussion unfolded, Ragnar stood near the fireplace, his gaze fixed on the group. It was as if he understood every word being spoken. Evelyn approached him cautiously, kneeling down to look into his glowing eyes. "Is it true?" she whispered. "Are you something more?" Ragnar tilted his head, then pressed his forehead against hers. In that moment, a wave of warmth and understanding washed over her. Images flooded her mind. Ancient forests, glowing constellations, and battles fought long ago to protect the natural world. She gasped, pulling back, her eyes wide. "I saw something," she said, her voice shaking. "It's like he showed me his memories." Mr. Grant nodded solemnly. "If he's truly one of the guardians, he might be trying to communicate with you. He's chosen you, Evelyn." Their moment of revelation was interrupted by the distant sound of engines. Josh ran to the window, his face pale. "They found us." Outside, black SUVs roared up the dirt road, their tires kicking up clouds of dust. Armed agents poured out, their weapons glinting in the sunlight. "We don't have much time," Mr. Grant said, grabbing a bag of supplies. "Evelyn, take Ragnar and head into the forest. There's a hidden path behind the cabin that leads to an old cave system. It's your best chance." "What about you?" Evelyn asked, panic rising in her chest. "We'll hold them off," Josh said, picking up a metal pipe from the fireplace tools. "Just go." Tears streaming down her face, Evelyn grabbed Ragnar's leash and bolted out the back door. The forest was dense, the undergrowth tugging at her clothes as she ran. Ragnar stayed close, his powerful body moving effortlessly through the terrain. After what felt like hours, they reached the entrance to the caves. The opening was small, almost hidden by a thicket of vines. Evelyn pushed them aside and slipped through, Ragnar following close behind. Inside, the air was cool and damp, the walls shimmering faintly in the dim light. As they ventured deeper, Evelyn's steps slowed. The cave opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling dotted with glowing crystals that cast an ethereal light. In the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, etched with ancient symbols. Ragnar walked toward the pedestal, his glowing eyes reflecting the light of the crystals. He let out a low, melodic howl, and the chamber seemed to respond, the symbols on the pedestal lighting up one by one. "What is this place?" Evelyn whispered, awestruck. The pedestal emitted a soft hum, and a holographic image appeared above it. A map marked with locations all over the world. Evelyn realized they were connected somehow, each point representing a place Ragnar's kind once protected. "This is where we find the truth," she said, determination replacing her fear. Evelyn stood frozen in the glowing chamber, the weight of everything she had learned pressing down on her. The holographic map flickered softly, its points of light pulsing in unison, as if urging her to act. Ragnar remained by her side, his glowing eyes fixed on the pedestal, a low rumble resonating in his chest. The sound of footsteps echoed from the cave entrance. Evelyn's heart sank as she realized the agents had followed them. She turned toward Ragnar, her voice trembling. "They're coming. What do we do?" Ragnar let out a deep, resonant howl that reverberated through the chamber. The crystals overhead responded, glowing brighter and casting shifting patterns of light across the walls. It felt as though the entire cave had come alive, pulsing with an ancient energy. The agents appeared at the cave entrance, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Evelyn stepped protectively in front of Ragnar, her fists clenched. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice echoing in the cavern. "He's not a threat." One of the agents, the tall man who had taken Ragnar from the clinic, stepped forward. "You don't understand, miss. That creature is dangerous. It doesn't belong here." "You don't understand," Evelyn shot back. "He's not just a creature. He's a guardian. He's here to protect us, not hurt us." The man hesitated, his expression conflicted. But before he could respond, a sharp voice cut through the tension. "Enough!" A woman stepped forward, her uniform bearing a higher rank than the others. Her piercing gaze swept over the scene, lingering on Ragnar. "This isn't about protection. That thing is an anomaly, and anomalies are unpredictable." Ragnar growled, his fur bristling as the agents raised their weapons. Evelyn's pulse raced. She knew they wouldn't listen. They were too afraid of what they didn't understand. "Don't do this," Evelyn pleaded. "If you take him, you'll destroy something ancient, something important." The woman raised her hand, signaling the agents to prepare. But before they could act, Ragnar stepped forward, his glowing eyes locking onto hers. He let out a low, mournful sound, then turned to Evelyn, nudging her hand gently with his nose. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "Ragnar, no. Don't let them take you." But Ragnar had made his choice. He let out another howl, louder and more powerful than before. The light in the chamber intensified, the crystals emitting a blinding glow. The agents shielded their eyes, their formation breaking as the ground trembled beneath them. When the light dimmed, Ragnar was gone. Evelyn stumbled forward, her hands reaching out to where he had stood moments before. The chamber was silent now, the holographic map faded. The agents looked around, their faces a mix of confusion and awe. "He vanished," one of them muttered. The woman in charge lowered her weapon, her stern expression softening. "Call off the operation," she said quietly. "There's nothing left to capture." Evelyn sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She felt an ache deep in her chest, a void left by Ragnar's absence. But as the agents began to retreat, she noticed something on the pedestal, a small, glowing crystal. She picked it up, its warmth spreading through her hand. In that moment, she felt Ragnar's presence, a comforting reassurance that he was still watching over her. Back at the cabin, Evelyn sat by the fireplace, the crystal resting in her palm. Mr. Grant and Josh sat nearby, their faces somber but supportive. "What do we do now?" Josh asked. Evelyn looked at the crystal, its light pulsing faintly. "We keep his legacy alive. Whatever he was protecting, whatever his kind stood for, it's our job to honor that." The storm outside had passed, and the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees. Evelyn felt a sense of peace, knowing that Ragnar's sacrifice had not been in vain. He had trusted her, and she wouldn't let him down. As the family prepared to move forward, a faint howl echoed in the distance, carried by the wind. Evelyn smiled through her tears, clutching the crystal tightly. Ragnar was gone, but his spirit would always remain with her. And somewhere, in the farthest reaches of the world, the ancient guardians stirred, their watchful eyes turning toward a new dawn. Thank you for being part of Ragnar's incredible journey. If the story moved you or kept you on the edge of your seat, please take a moment to like this video. It really helps more people discover stories like this. Don't forget to share it with your friends and family who love thrilling, heartfelt tales, and make sure to subscribe to my channel for more captivating adventures. Also, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you do if you found out your pet was more than just a pet? Let me know in the comments below.